Next thing I want to look at is creating a fair, non-biased, and compliant selection. So this really is, in my opinion, the bread and butter of why we're talking today, and it's why we built the platform. It's what I'm very, very passionate about. You are a mission-driven organization awarding funding to people to change their lives or change society. If that's the case, we have to make sure that we give it the attention it deserves and that proper applicants get the chance that they deserve. I can't reiterate enough how passionate we are about this. So what's going to end up happening is to create these kind of compliant, fair, non-biased selection processes, there's two core components that come into play. Number one is we have to create an ecosystem that ensures that the applicants are properly being assigned out to the right individuals to review them. And number two, those individuals aren't seeing information that may cloudy their judgment. So there's so many ways to create these review processes and workflows. I'm not going to get into that today. If you're an organization that offers multiple different types of grants, that's one way you can categorize them. If you're a grant maker that offers grants, say for example, like individuals of need, it could be for housing, it could be for utilities, it could be for healthcare, it could be for food. That's one way to categorize it. Many of you may have multiple phases of review. So applications come in, you go through a vetting process, you then go through a judging and selection process. It goes off to the board for final selection. Again, there are countless ways of doing this. With that said, it doesn't really matter because one thing I want to do is that number one is that you need to be aware of what the workload capacities are of your review team. We have so many organizations that have some type of review team that reviews every single grant application. And if you're a small grant provider, that's okay. The challenge is when you have 20, 30, 40, 50, 156,000 submissions, your team physically can't review all of them. And I don't really care how much we think that they can. There's some pretty clear data that backs up that after roughly 20 or so grant applications at a given time, their workload capacity starts to really significantly drop off. They're giving numbers 18, 19, and 20 less energy than numbers 1, 2, and 3. That in itself is going to cause a problem. So how do we combat this? So the idea is to somehow create some type of randomization as well as equal distribution to your team. But the only way that this can work is if there's some type of data to kind of identify what those workload capacities look like. So if you're not currently surveying or working with your review teams to identify how long does it take you to fill out grant scorecards, how many submissions do you feel comfortable reviewing, then this all goes out the window. Once we know what that looks like, though, then we can start to create these review phases where we do random distribution. The second piece of that is the redaction of data. Again, this is very specific to your programming, but we want to make sure that we're not having evaluators whose judgment is being cloudy by things like who people are, demographic backgrounds, if they know them personally or not. So generally speaking, if you consider something to be PII, or if you're wondering if it is, it probably is err on the side of caution. Obviously, things like name, email addresses, that's very easy to redact. If you want to be really comprehensive, we got to move short form content out of file uploads and into open-ended text fields into a platform like Reviewr. So that way, when you go to do redaction, it's significantly easier. I also want to note that these review processes can be comprehensive, and so if you're collecting information for record keeping purposes, don't show it to the review team if it's not specific to the selection. It just overwhelms them. So again, show them only what they need. Now, this is a critical component, which is the next piece of this conversation, which is going to be the utilization of what I call normalization reporting. So what's going to happen is anytime you do a random distribution of submissions to a team, it implies that not every applicant gets reviewed by the same people. So what happens now if you've got some evaluators that on average are a bit more harsh as they score or a bit easier? That has a direct impact on the overall results. So we'll come back to that. So how do we handle these workflows? How do you visualize that? So at least in a platform like Reviewr, you've got these really cool tools called workflows or these bucketing systems. And again, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds today on how to structure this because it's going to be very specific to your desired process. But at its core, you create these buckets. So in this example, I have kind of two different formats, one of which is, 5 different types of grants being provided. The other is phases and workflows. So the general thought here is that applicants who are applying will pick what grant they're submitting for. So in this example, I got the Lennox Wilder grant. The next step is to fill up that bucket with a review team. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this out to Simon, Paula, and Mark. When they come into Reviewr, they're only going to see the grantee applicants in the bucket that they'd be given access to. Now, you can also have like what I call like a judge manager, so a dedicated individual who's overseeing their own kind of committee members. And this is great from a data security perspective because now we're limiting that number of people to only the submissions in their bucket. Now, if your team is reviewing multiple grants or multiple phases of review, that's fine. You just give them access to multiple buckets. What I really want to get to here, though, is when I open these workflows up, it's going to show me two different lists. One is a listing of all of the applicants in that bucket, and then the other is the potential review committee. That potential is the key word because just because they're in the bucket doesn't always imply that they're going to review everybody. So the way that I want this to work is I can take all of my applicants and I want to do two quick things. Number one is I want to figure out how many reviews each evaluator is comfortable submitting. And I also want to work backwards to figure out, well, how many individual reviews does an applicant need to make sure that we have a good reflection of the quality of the submission. So in that example, maybe we say, well, I want my review team to get no more than 20, but no less than 15. But you also have to ensure that every grantee is reviewed exactly 5 times, either no more, no less, or maybe no more than 6 times, no less than 4. So in Reviewr, again, taking human judgment out of this, I can bulk select people, and I can actually type in those parameters. I can physically type in, give each applicant no more than 6 evaluators and no less than 4, and then the system will in real time divvy it out to your staff in an equal random fashion. Now, if you need to, if an evaluator recuses themselves, or if you want to have more control over this, that's great. You can actually, on a per person, individually uncheck and reassign them back out. So there's that kind of component to it. The next thing I want to look at is actually two things. One is the redaction of data. And if I jump back over to my presentation, we do have a slide that I'm not going to talk about, but I'll share this afterwards, called the broadening of the criteria. Instead, I'm just going to show this to you and kind of address it as we go. So what does that mean? When a review committee member comes into Reviewr, they will basically get a menu, and that menu is going to be a listing of all of the grantees that that person is supposed to be evaluating. Again, if you're redacting of data, which I highly suggest, things like your name won't show up here. It's just going to be an ID number. So the evaluator simply clicks into the individual and they get a split screen. So half of their page is what I call a profile, and the other half is your selection tool. Now, again, not to get too deep into Reviewr, the selection tool is completely custom. I do want to kind of point out, though, that as you can see here, if I scroll down, it is independent. So the team can kind of side by side read through grant applications, look at deliverables, look at files, and fill out their score sheets. Again, typically a score sheet won't just be math. It's going to be a combination of like question, score, comment, things like that. But the reason why I want to bring that up is you can see here there is no point values being associated. This is that trend that I talked about where evaluators get very bogged down in numbers, and we want to make sure that we lower the barrier for them and keep them hyper focused on the task at hand. So I think the proper way and the trend of structuring a scorecard is to align the questions with your mission, your vision, and what you're looking for in a grantee. From there, instead of asking your evaluators to assign a point value, because they're going to start to say, well, what's the difference between like a 16 and a 17, right? And it seems like a small detail, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. It ultimately changes the results of a program. So treat it like a reference. You just ask them to answer a series of questions, typically trying to get an emotional response out of them. So the evaluator can side by side read through the grant application. They can jump up top. They can look at attachments. All those files get embedded right in Reviewr. They can jump up to like any additional deliverables like grant reporting templates, because again, for multi-phase programs, you have to review them as they go. Those templates show up right in Reviewr. And they answer a series of questions, from good to great, or thumbs up, thumbs down, good, great, ugly, whatever you can dream up. Now, behind the scenes, there is a point value associated with those choices. So the evaluator isn't concerned about allocating points. They're just using their judgment and their emotion to assign how they feel about it. And then it'll start to assign points on the back end. So for you in the operations team, you actually get these real-time leaderboards, and it shows you in real time every applicant who applied by a per bucket basis. It shows you the committee that reviewed them and then how they review them on an individual basis, total scores, averages, you name it. So for many of you, it's a really great tool to pull up for like deliberation to kind of talk through the results. Many of you may use this for the end all be all selections. I would say most people use this in a combination of all of it. They might take like their top 20 applicants and then at the bottom move them to phase 2 review, phase 3 review, final selection. They then pull this up in a board meeting, they review them, they talk about them, etc.